The date is April 14th, 1945. The time is just after midnight. The location is a makeshift command post somewhere in the forested hills west of the Ruhr River, Germany. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke, sweat, and defeat. Maps cover every flat surface, their neat lines and symbols now a mockery of the chaos unfolding outside. This is the headquarters of Army Group B, the last significant German fighting force on the Western Front. And its commander, Field Marshal Walter Model, is presiding over a funeral. For 2 weeks, what was once a formidable army group has been trapped. In a brilliant and rapid advance, the American 12th Army Group, under General Omar Bradley, has executed a classic pincer movement. The U.S. First Army, commanded by the quiet professional General Courtney Hodges, drove from the south, while General William Simpson's U.S. Ninth Army slammed the door from the north. The jaws of this great steel trap snapped shut on April 1st, encircling Germany's industrial heartland and nearly 400,000 German soldiers. They call it the Ruhr Pocket. For the men inside, it is a cauldron of despair. The situation is beyond dire. It is hopeless. The remnants of 19 German divisions, including the once feared 5th Panzer Army, are packed into a shrinking perimeter, hammered day and night by American artillery and air power. They have almost no fuel to move their tanks, no ammunition for their guns, and no food for their soldiers. Communication between units is breaking down. The vaunted Wehrmacht has been reduced to a starving, exhausted mob, waiting for the end. Just hours ago, the Americans sliced the pocket in two, separating the 15th Army from the 5th Panzer Army and tightening the noose. Yet, from the Führerbunker in Berlin, the orders remain absolute, transmitted with the shrieking static of a regime in its death throes. A direct command from Adolf Hitler declaring the Ruhr a fortress, a Festung. The order crackling over the radio was unambiguous. Fortress Ruhr will be held. There will be no surrender. There will be no breakout. Every man will fight where he stands until the last bullet. This is a direct order from the Führer. To fight to the last man. It is a suicide order, a demand for a glorious, pointless sacrifice to delay the inevitable by a few more days. For Field Marshal Model, a man known as Hitler's fireman for his legendary ability to salvage lost causes on the Eastern Front, this order is his entire world. He is a product of the Prussian officer corps, a man for whom duty and loyalty to his oath are paramount. He has always found a way, but here in the rubble of his homeland there is no way out, only down. His chief of staff, General Major Karl Wagener, a pragmatic officer who sees the faces of the doomed men, not the symbols on a map, has been urging the unthinkable, to capitulate, to save the lives of what remains of their army for the rebuilding of a Germany that must come after this madness. But surrender is forbidden. A German field marshal does not surrender. Model himself had said it, sneering at Field Marshal Paulus for his capture at Stalingrad. Such a thing is just not possible. But in the ashes of this command post, another idea begins to form. A forbidden concept, an act that is not in any military textbook. It is a tactic born of pure desperation, a solution that exists in the gray space between loyalty and treason. It is an idea that will allow him to uphold the letter of his oath while violating its spirit in the most dramatic way imaginable. He will not surrender his army. He will dissolve it. He picks up a pen. The fate of over 300,000 men rests on the next order he writes. It will be his final command, an act of supreme defiance against the very man he swore to obey. With a quiet, determined stroke, he would set in motion a plan that would lead to the largest surrender on the Western Front, a surrender he would never call by its name. To understand the enormity of the decision made in that smoke-filled bunker, you must first understand the man who made it. Otto Moritz Walter Model was not born into the Prussian aristocracy that defined the German officer corps. He was the son of a music teacher, a middle-class boy who joined the army in 1909 and fought his way up through sheer force of will. He was abrasive, profane, and universally disliked by his staff officers, whom he drove relentlessly. But he was respected and even loved by the common soldiers. They saw a man who led from the front, who shared their dangers, and who possessed an almost supernatural talent for defensive warfare. His entire career was forged in crisis. On the Eastern Front, whenever a sector was about to collapse under the weight of the Soviet juggernaut, Hitler would send for Model. He would arrive, stabilize the front, and plug the gap, earning him the nickname the Savior of the Eastern Front. His success was rooted in his incredible grasp of tactical detail and a fanatical, unshakable belief in National Socialist ideology. He would often lecture his own troops on the need for absolute faith in the Führer. This fanatical loyalty, this reputation as a hardline fighter who would never yield, is precisely what makes his final act so psychologically complex and historically significant. He was the last man anyone would expect to break. The strategic nightmare he now faced was a masterpiece of American military power. After breaking out from the Normandy beaches, the Allied war machine had ground its way to the borders of Germany. The U.S. 12th Army Group, a force of over 1.3 million men, was the largest single American field command in history. Its commander, Omar Bradley, was methodical and brilliant. His plan to encircle Army Group B was a textbook example of modern mobile warfare. The Southern Pincer was led by General Hodge's First Army, a veteran force that had fought its way across France and Belgium. The Northern Pincer was General Simpson's Ninth Army, which had been temporarily assigned to British Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group before reverting to Bradley's command for the encirclement. Facing this onslaught were the tattered remnants of German power in the West. Model's Army Group B was a shadow of its former self. It included General Gustav Adolf von Zangen's 15th Army and the 5th Panzer Army under General Joseph Harp. These were armies on paper only. They were a patchwork of exhausted veterans, SS training units, old men from the Volkssturm militia, and boys from the Hitler Jugend, some as young as 12. Half of his men didn't even have rifles. They were low on everything: fuel, ammunition, food, and worst of all, hope. Inside Model's headquarters, the atmosphere was one of grim resolve mixed with encroaching despair. His chief of staff, General Major Karl Wagner, was the voice of reason. A career officer, Wagner understood the brutal arithmetic of their situation. He saw the futility in sacrificing thousands of lives for a cause that was already lost. He repeatedly and bravely confronted Model, arguing that the duty of a commander was not to his Führer's fantasies, but to the men under his command. Their conversations were tense, a battle between ideology and pragmatism. The clock was ticking, measured in the relentless rhythm of American artillery shells. The airwaves flooded with panicked calls, painting a picture of total collapse. A voice from the city of Hagen screamed that they were being overrun, that the Americans were across the river, and they had no anti-tank guns left. Another reported the 5th Panzer Army had lost all contact with its neighboring corps, its last transmission a desperate request for orders into a deadening silence. The official plan to hold Fortress Ruhr had failed. It was not a plan. It was a death sentence. And as the American pincers tightened, slicing his command in two, Walter Model, Hitler's fireman, found himself in a fire he could not put out. He could either follow his orders and burn with his army, or commit an act of treason to save them. The loyalist was about to become the rebel. The spark that ignited the final desperate plan came not from a map, but from a message. On April 15th, an American officer approached the German lines under a flag of truce. He carried a formal demand for surrender from Major General Matthew Ridgway, the commander of the U.S. 18th Airborne Corps. Ridgway, a tough, no-nonsense paratrooper, appealed to Model as a fellow soldier to end the pointless bloodshed. For Model, a formal surrender was impossible. He sent back a terse reply, stating that his honor as a field marshal and his oath to Adolf Hitler prevented him from capitulating. The American offer was rejected, but the interaction had planted a seed. It forced Model to confront the question head-on. How does a commander act when defeat is total, but surrender is forbidden? It was in the aftermath of this refusal that he found his answer, a solution that was as cunning as it was audacious. He gathered his remaining staff. His face was a mask of exhaustion, but his voice was clear. He would not surrender Army Group B. Instead, he would declare it no longer existed. The order he drafted was a masterpiece of military legalese, designed to provide his soldiers with the justification they needed to save themselves without technically disobeying the Führer's no-surrender command. First, the Army Group was formally dissolved. This was an administrative act of incredible audacity. An entire Army Group simply erased from the order of battle by its own commander. Second, he discharged the oldest and youngest soldiers from service. The men of the Volkssturm and the boys of the Hitler Jugend were to discard their uniforms and simply go home. He was, with the stroke of a pen, turning soldiers back into civilians. Third, and most crucially, came the order for the remaining combat troops. All formations were to be broken down. There would be no more organized resistance. Ammunition was to be expended or destroyed. After that, the order was implicit. Every man for himself. They were permitted to try and break out east in small groups, or to simply go home. This phrase, go home, was the key. To go home, a soldier trapped deep inside American lines had only one possible path, through an American prisoner of war cage. It was an unofficial, unwritten, but universally understood order to surrender. From the American perspective, the effect of this order was baffling and then overwhelming. On April 15th, German resistance was sporadic but occasionally fierce. On April 16th, it began to collapse entirely. The men of the U.S. First and Ninth Armies, accustomed to hard fighting, watched in amazement as the enemy simply stopped fighting. At first, it was a trickle, a lone German soldier emerging from the woods with his hands up, then a squad carrying a white handkerchief tied to a rifle. Then the trickle became a flood. Entire companies, battalions, and eventually the remnants of entire divisions began marching towards the American lines. They came out of the forests, out of the bombed-out cellars of cities like Dusseldorf and Essen, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The Americans who had been broadcasting loudspeaker appeals to give up found themselves with more prisoners than they knew what to do with. The sheer numbers were staggering. Allied intelligence had estimated there were perhaps 150,000 troops in the pocket. By the time the final count was taken, over 317,000 German soldiers had been taken prisoner. It was the largest single capture of enemy forces in the history of the U.S. Army, a haul of men that dwarfed even the great surrenders in North Africa and at Stalingrad. The American GIs, who had been fighting these same men for months, were stunned. There was no single dramatic ceremony. The war on the Western Front was ending not with a bang, but with the shuffling feet of a defeated army walking into captivity. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was profound. They had been trapped, starving, and ordered to die for a lost cause. Model's order was a release, a permission to live. A captured German officer from the 116th Panzer Division, a unit that no longer had a single working tank or a single artillery shell, explained the situation bluntly in his debriefing. He told his captors, "We had no food, no ammunition. The Field Marshal's order, it was the end. We were told the army was no more. What is the point to continue? There was no point. So we came out. We were not facing an army anymore. We were facing ghosts, ghosts of our own command." This captured officer's words validated the brilliance of Model's forbidden solution. He had not surrendered his army. He had transformed it into a ghost, an entity that ceased to exist, freeing its component parts to seek survival. He had found a way to save his men while, in his own mind, preserving his honor as a field marshal. It was a semantic victory, perhaps, but one that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The first people to render a verdict on Field Marshal Model's final order were the men whose lives it spared. For the common German Lanzer trapped in the Ruhr, the dissolution of Army Group B was not treason. It was a reprieve from a death sentence. As tens of thousands surrendered, their overriding emotion was not shame, but profound relief. One young soldier, captured by men of the U.S. 8th Infantry Division, was recorded as saying to his captors, "Thank you. For us, the war is over." He wasn't thanking the Americans for capturing him. He was thanking them for being there, for providing an alternative to the suicidal last stand Hitler had demanded. In a strange and ironic twist, the American army had become their salvation. But while his soldiers were marching into the relative safety of POW camps, Model faced his own internal reckoning. There would be no formal debriefing with a superior officer. His superior was Adolf Hitler, and the verdict from Berlin was swift and absolute. As news of the collapse in the Ruhr reached the Führer bunker, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels took to the radio. He denounced Model and the men of Army Group B as traitors, cowards who had failed in their sacred duty to the Reich. For Model, the man who had built his career on unwavering loyalty, this was the final, devastating blow. He had been branded a traitor by the very regime he had served with such fanatical devotion. His final conversations with his few remaining staff officers were heavy with the weight of this damnation. He paced back and forth, a ghost in the ruins of his own command. "Has everything been done," he asked his chief of staff, General Wagner, "to justify our actions in the light of history?" His defense, his irrefutable logic, was not an excuse offered to a superior, but a justification whispered to himself. He had not surrendered. A field marshal does not become a prisoner. He repeated the phrase like a mantra. He had found the only way out that his rigid, Prussian-molded code of honor would allow. He had sacrificed his reputation to save his men, but the cost was immense. He was a man without an army, without a Führer, and without a future. His decision was also influenced by another, more chilling piece of news. He learned that the Soviets had declared him a war criminal for his actions on the Eastern Front, specifically for the brutal anti-partisan warfare and scorched earth policies his Ninth Army had carried out. They had indicted him for the deaths of over 500,000 people in concentration camps in Latvia. Capture by the Americans would almost certainly lead to him being handed over to the Soviets for trial and execution. There would be no grudging vindication from a superior, no quiet medal ceremony. His unsung reward was the avoidance of what he considered the ultimate shame, capture and a show trial. For a man like Walter Model, there was only one path left: On the afternoon of April 21st, 1945, 9 days before his Führer would do the same in Berlin, Model walked with his aide, Colonel Theodor Pilling, into a wooded area between the city of Duisburg and the village of Lintorf. He turned to his last loyal officer. "My hour has come," he said. "You will bury me here." Then he drew his pistol and took his own life. The fireman had finally been consumed by the flames. The ultimate proof of a battlefield innovation's genius is its adoption into official military doctrine. While Walter Model's specific act of dissolving his own command was a unique event born of a unique crisis, the underlying principle had a profound impact. The Ruhr pocket became a case study at military academies, not for German actions, but for the success of the American envelopment and the effectiveness of psychological operations. The lesson learned was clear. Once an army is physically encircled and psychologically convinced of its hopeless position, its will to fight can be systematically dismantled. The tactic of using loudspeaker broadcasts and leaflet drops, urging soldiers to surrender not as a matter of cowardice but as a logical choice, was validated on a massive scale. This became a key component of what would later be formalized in U.S. doctrine as psychological operations, or PSY ops. The historical record is filled with testimonies that validate the surreal nature of those final days. An officer in the U.S. First Army wrote in his report, "We did not destroy Army Group B. It simply ceased to exist. It disintegrated before our eyes, and we were left to sweep up the pieces." For the Americans, it was an anticlimactic, almost administrative end to a brutal campaign. For the Germans, it was the definitive end of the war in the West. One German veteran writing years later recalled the moment he heard Model's order. "We were in a cellar waiting to die. Then the captain came. He said the army group was finished. We were free to go. We burned our papers, threw our rifles in a stream, and walked west until we saw an American jeep. That was it. The war was over. The field marshal gave us back our lives." This stands in strong contrast to Walter Model's own end. His quiet, violent death in a secluded forest is the ultimate paradox. The fanatical loyalist committed an act of supreme defiance. The master of defense orchestrated a mass surrender. The hard, ruthless general made a decision that was, in its own way, deeply humanitarian. He chose personal damnation to grant his men a future. After the war, his son, guided by Model's aid, would locate the field grave and have his father's remains moved to a German military cemetery in Fussloch, where he rests today. Perhaps the most powerful reflection on his decision comes from Model himself in the final question he posed to his staff before walking into the woods. It serves as his final word, an epitaph for a man caught between his duty and his conscience. He asked them, what can there be left for a commander in defeat? In antiquity, they took poison. He saw only two paths for a defeated general: shame or death. He chose death, but in doing so, he granted over 300,000 other men the one thing he denied himself: the chance to go home. A field marshal does not become a prisoner, but his final forbidden order saved more lives than any of his famous defensive battles. If you found this story of a complex and controversial decision as fascinating as we did, be sure to subscribe to WW2 Explained and join us as we continue to uncover the secret history of the war. Let us know in the comments which unsung story we should feature next.